September 14th, 1963. London, England. A 17-year-old boy named Farrokh Bulsara walked out of the Royal Academy of Music with a rejection letter folded in his trembling hands. What his mother said to him that evening would change the course of music history forever. The morning had started with such promise. Farrokh had taken the bus from his family's modest flat in Feltham at 5:30 a.m., 3 hours before his audition. The streets of London were still dark, lit only by the amber glow of street lamps reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. He'd worn his only good shirt, the white one his mother Jer had pressed the night before, staying up until midnight to make sure every crease was perfect. She'd even sewn a loose button back on, her fingers working by candlelight while his father Bohemian slept, because they couldn't afford to waste electricity. In his worn leather satchel, the one his grandfather had given him before he left Zanzibar, he carried sheet music he'd annotated himself, hundreds of pencil marks showing where he'd planned every breath, every crescendo, every moment of dynamic tension. He'd practiced those pages until the paper had grown soft from the oils of his fingertips, until he could play the piece with his eyes closed and still hit every note perfectly. The bus ride took 47 minutes. Farrokh counted every one of them. He sat in the back, watching London wake up through rain-streaked windows, milkmen making their rounds, shop owners rolling up metal shutters, a city of millions, and he felt invisible among them. Just another brown-skinned immigrant boy with impossible dreams. He thought about his journey to this moment. The boy who would become Freddie Mercury had been preparing for this audition his entire life. Born in Zanzibar to Parsi parents, raised in boarding schools in India where he'd discovered the piano at age 7, Farrokh had music woven into his very soul. At St. Peter's School in Panchgani, he would sneak into the music room after lights out, playing by moonlight because daytime practice hours were never enough. His teachers in Bombay had called him gifted. "This boy doesn't just play music," his piano instructor Mr. De Silva had written in a letter to his parents. "He channels something divine." His classmates said he played like someone possessed, his whole body swaying with the melodies, his eyes closed as if he were somewhere else entirely. The other boys had mocked him for it, called him dramatic, called him feminine, called him other words that hurt too much to remember. But none of that seemed to matter now. All those years of practice, all those nights of sneaking into music rooms, all those moments of being told he was too much, had led him to this morning, to this audition, to what he believed would be his vindication. When he arrived at the Royal Academy of Music at 8:17 a.m., he stood outside the building for a full 10 minutes, just staring up at its magnificent facade. The morning rain had stopped, leaving everything gleaming and clean. This was the temple of classical music in Britain. Composers whose names lived forever had walked through these doors. And today, so would he. The Royal Academy of Music audition room was everything young Farrokh had dreamed of. Grand piano in the center, a Steinway Model D that seemed to glow under the overhead lights, portraits of composers lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch, to judge. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, legends staring down at this nervous boy from Zanzibar. 3 adjudicators sitting behind a mahogany table, their faces unreadable masks of professional assessment. The room smelled of old wood and lemon polish, and centuries of musical ambition. He'd played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Every note had been perfect. He knew it. His fingers had flown across the keys with the precision of a master craftsman, each phrase shaped with the care of someone who understood not just the mechanics, but the soul of the music. He'd felt it in his bones, that electric connection between his heart and the instrument. This was more than performance. This was communion. When he finished, his hands were trembling. He looked up at the 3 adjudicators, hoping to see something, anything, in their expressions. Professor Edmund Whitfield, the head adjudicator, had made a note on his paper. Just one note. Then he'd looked up with eyes that held no warmth, But perfect technique wasn't what they were looking for. Professor Whitfield had been polite, but firm. His words delivered in that clipped British accent that turned criticism into something that sounded almost reasonable. Mr. Bulsara, your technical proficiency is undeniable. However, the Royal Academy seeks musicians who demonstrate classical restraint and traditional interpretation. Your performance, while technically sound, showed an unfortunate tendency toward theatrical excess and emotional flamboyance that doesn't align with our institution's standards. We appreciate your interest, but we will not be offering you a place. Theatrical excess, emotional flamboyance, unfortunate tendency. The words cut deeper than any blade. Farrokh had simply played what he felt. He'd poured his heart into those keys, let the music speak through him rather than merely playing notes on a page. He'd moved with the music because how could you not? How could you sit rigid and unmoved while Chopin's genius flowed through your fingers? And for that authentic expression, for that vulnerable honesty, he'd been deemed unsuitable, not good enough, not appropriate, not right. He'd managed to maintain his composure long enough to thank them, to gather his sheet music with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, to walk out of that room with his head held high. But the moment he was outside, the moment the heavy doors of the Royal Academy closed behind him, something crumbled inside him. He sat on that bus ride home with the rejection letter burning in his pocket, the formal letterhead with its elegant script mocking his dreams. Every bump in the road felt like another reminder of his failure. The gray London sky seemed to mirror the heaviness in his chest, clouds pressing down like the weight of inadequacy. Passengers got on and off around him, living their ordinary lives while his entire world had just collapsed. He was 17 years old, and the institution he'd believed would validate his dreams, that would tell him he belonged somewhere, had told him he was too much, too theatrical, too emotional, too different. The same criticisms he'd heard his whole life, just delivered in more refined language. He wasn't British enough, wasn't classical enough, wasn't restrained enough, wasn't white enough, though they'd never say that part out loud. When he finally walked through the door of the Bulsara family flat at 6:40 p.m., his mother Jer was waiting in the kitchen. She'd been preparing aloo gobi, his favorite dish, the scent of cumin and turmeric filling the small space. She took one look at her son's face and knew. "They said no," Farrokh whispered. His voice cracked. "They said I play with too much emotion, that I'm too theatrical." Jer Bulsara was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, every syllable carried weight. She wiped her hands on her apron, walked over to her son, and placed both palms on his cheeks. Her dark eyes, warm and fierce, locked onto his. "Too much emotion?" she said. "Beta, listen to me very carefully." What she said next would echo through the decades. "The world doesn't need another musician who plays it safe. There are 1,000 pianists who can play every note perfectly, who can follow every rule, who can fit into neat little boxes." She paused, her voice dropping to something between a whisper and a command. "But you, my son, you were not born to fit. You were born to shatter those boxes into a million pieces. Your emotion, your theatricality, the fire they see as excess, that is your gift. That is what will make people remember your name long after those judges have been forgotten." Farrokh's tears were falling freely now. "They rejected what makes you extraordinary because they fear it," Jer continued. "But one day, the whole world will celebrate the very things they tried to dim. You don't need their academy. You need to be brave enough to become exactly who you are, not who they tell you to be." She pulled him into an embrace, and in that small kitchen in Feltham, something fundamental shifted. The hurt was still there, but beneath it, an ember of defiance began to glow. "Promise me something," Jer said, pulling back to look at him again. "Promise me you will never make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never built for greatness. Promise me you will be so magnificently yourself that the world has no choice but to make room." "I promise, Mummy," Farouk said. The words felt like a vow. Jer reached into her jewelry box and pulled out a small silver ring, simple and unadorned. "This was my mother's. She wore it every day of her life. She was a woman who refused to be quiet in a world that demanded women's silence. I want you to have it. Wear it when you need to remember who you are." Farouk slipped the ring onto his pinky finger. It fit perfectly. The next morning, something had changed in the young man who left that flat. His walk had a different energy. His eyes held a new determination. He didn't throw away the sheet music he'd prepared for the Royal Academy. Instead, he used it as a foundation to build something entirely his own. He started spending every evening at a local music shop on Brentford High Street, teaching himself music theory from books he couldn't afford to buy, memorizing pages while standing in the aisles. The shop owner, an elderly man named Morris, noticed the dedicated teenager and started leaving certain books out for him, pretending not to see when Farouk stayed past closing time. 6 months later, Farouk joined his first band. They called themselves the Hectics. They played covers at school dances and local pubs. Nothing fancy, nothing like the classical stages he'd once dreamed of. But when he sat at that piano, he played with every ounce of emotion those Royal Academy judges had told him to suppress. And people listened. They didn't just listen, they felt. He changed his name to Freddie during those years, embracing a new identity that matched the boldness growing inside him. The theatrical excess? He doubled down on it. The emotional flamboyance? He made it his signature. Everything those judges had criticized became the foundation of his artistic identity. In 1970, 7 years after that rejection letter, Freddie Mercury joined a band called Queen. He wore his mother's ring on his pinky finger at every rehearsal, every recording session, every performance. It became as much a part of him as his voice. By 1975, Queen had released Bohemian Rhapsody, a song that shattered every rule of conventional rock music. 6 minutes long when radio stations demanded 3. Operatic sections in a rock song. Theatrical to the extreme. Emotionally excessive by any traditional standard. It was everything the Royal Academy had told 17-year-old Farouk he shouldn't be. It became one of the most celebrated songs in music history. But here's the part that very few people know. In 1981, 18 years after his rejection, Freddie Mercury was invited to perform at a charity gala at the Royal Albert Hall. The event was attended by members of the Royal Academy of Music faculty. 3 of the adjudicators from his original audition were in the audience that night. Freddie took the stage wearing his iconic yellow military jacket, his mother's silver ring catching the spotlight. He performed Somebody to Love with a passion that made the chandeliers seem to vibrate. When he hit those impossibly high notes, when he commanded that audience with theatrical gestures and emotional abandon, the entire hall rose to their feet. After the performance, Professor Edmund Whitfield, now retired and in his 70s, approached Freddie backstage. His hands were shaking. "Mr. Mercury," he said, "I was one of the adjudicators who rejected your application in 1963. Freddie remembered. Of course he remembered. "I need you to know," Whitfield continued, his voice thick, "that rejection was the greatest professional mistake of my life. We weren't looking for genius that day. We were looking for conformity, and we were too blind to see that genius never conforms." Freddie looked at this man who had once dismissed him, and he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a triumphant smile. A genuine, warm smile. "Thank you for rejecting me," Freddie said. "If you'd accepted me into the academy, I would have spent years trying to fit into a mold that would have destroyed everything that made me who I am. You gave me the gift of freedom, even if you didn't mean to." He reached into his pocket and pulled out that original rejection letter. He'd kept it for 18 years, carried it with him through every tour, every triumph. I keep this to remind myself that sometimes the people who say no to you are actually setting you free, Freddie said. He handed the letter to Whitfield. You keep it now. Maybe it will remind you to look for the extraordinary, not just the obedient. Whitfield took the letter with trembling hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. 3 months after that encounter, the Royal Academy of Music established the Freddie Mercury Scholarship for students who demonstrate unique artistic vision and emotional authenticity in their performances, even if it defies traditional conventions. The scholarship specifically seeks out students who have been told they're too much in their artistry, who bring passion that transcends technical perfection, who understand that music is meant to be felt, not just executed. The selection criteria explicitly states, "We are looking for students who would have been rejected by our institution 30 years ago." It's a remarkable admission, a public acknowledgement of systemic failure. The scholarship is funded by royalties from Queen's music, ensuring that Freddie's legacy continues to open doors that were once closed to him. Recipients of the scholarship receive not just financial support, but mentorship, performance opportunities, and a silver ring, a replica of the one Jer gave her son. They're told the story of the 17-year-old boy who was rejected, and they're reminded that their difference is their strength. To date, the program has supported 847 young musicians who didn't fit the classical mold, but had something essential to say through their music. Many have gone on to redefine their genres, to bring innovation to spaces that desperately needed it, to prove that the artistic establishment's narrow vision of excellence was never the only path to greatness. Among those recipients, a young violinist from South Korea who plays Bach with a rock sensibility, a pianist from Nigeria who blends classical technique with traditional African rhythms, a transgender opera singer whose voice defied every category the industry tried to put them in. Each one carries that replica ring. Each one knows that being told you're too much is sometimes the universe's way of saying you're exactly enough for something they can't even imagine yet. When Freddie passed away in 1991, they found his mother's silver ring still on his pinky finger. Jer Bulsara, who had given him that ring 28 years earlier in a small kitchen in Feltham, was with him at the end. She held his hand, the ring pressing between their palms. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You never made yourself smaller. You made the world bigger instead." That ring is now displayed at the Freddie Mercury Museum in Zanzibar, in a glass case next to the original rejection letter from the Royal Academy. Thousands of visitors come each year to see these artifacts. Many are young artists who have been told they're too much, too different, too theatrical, too emotional. They stand in front of that case and read the words that once tried to diminish one of music's greatest voices. And then they read the plaque next to it, which contains Jer Bulsara's words. "You were not born to fit. You were born to shatter those boxes into a million pieces." Oh! The story of Freddie Mercury isn't just about a legendary performer. It's about a 17-year-old boy who was rejected for being exactly who he was, and a mother who saw that rejection not as an ending, but as a liberation. It's about choosing authenticity over acceptance, passion over perfection, and the courage to be magnificently yourself in a world that profits from your self-doubt. Every artist who has ever been told they're too much, every person who has ever felt they don't fit, every soul who has been rejected for their authenticity, carries a piece of Farrokh Bulsara's story. Because his journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift is not being chosen by institutions that would have required you to dim your light. Sometimes the greatest gift is being forced to find your own stage, build your own spotlight, and shine so brightly that the whole world has no choice but to watch. Freddie Mercury didn't need the Royal Academy's approval. He needed his mother's wisdom, his own courage, and an unwavering belief that his difference was his power. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything. If this incredible story of a mother's wisdom transforming rejection into legendary success moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of staying true to yourself, even when the world says you're too much. Have you ever been told you were too emotional, too different, or too anything? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the heart and humanity behind music's greatest legends.